it's great to have so many of you back. We haven't had the conversation series in several months. Particularly honored to introduce Edward Miliband. This book could not be more timely. I was talking to Edward before we got on about some of our previous guests. I think of Ai-jen Poo, who is really at the center of the caring economy, and Biden's whole idea of the caring infrastructure has been built around money. Ed speaks about Katrin Jakobsdottir, the Prime Minister of Iceland, in the book, in terms of also the caring economy and leave policy, and she was one of our guests. Ed is a special guest. I'll tell you why, but he was in our offices in July 2016 and on his way to a conference on Brexit at NYU. And we had a good seminar. Ed told us about how we needed to think, which led to, I'm sure, some of this book. But we kept saying, well, Hillary Clinton's run a lousy campaign, but she's going to win. She's run a lousy campaign, she's going to win. And he's turned to us and said, I wouldn't be so sanguine, having just come off of Brexit in a district which I believe, Ed, voted overwhelmingly for leave. And that was, we thought back to that moment as the lights on the Javits Center dimmed that election night, 2016. Ed is the Labour MP for Doncaster North and has been an MP continuously since 2005. Currently serves as the Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy, previously leader of the Labour Party and the leader of the opposition between 2010 and 2015, resigning after Labour's defeat at the 2015 general election. Alongside his brother, former Foreign Secretary David Miliband, he served in the cabinet from 2007 to 2010 under Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He has a long record of great integrity in the House of Commons. During the 2009 parliamentary expenses scandal, Ed was named by the conservative Daily Telegraph as one of the, quote, saints of the scandal. He is, perhaps most importantly, a former nation intern, serving in the class of 1990. He is modest in this book with the not so modest title, Go Big, How to Fix Our World. He talks about himself as a recovering ex-leader, one day taking calls from President Obama, the next day, waiting for the phone to ring. But he has found his way with this book, which I know he'll tell us how it started, but it was a podcast and a very British name, like Reasons to Be Cheerful. Welcome. I'm just going to ask a few questions and turn it over to Don, who has known Ed for many years in London and here. I'm curious, Ed, in terms of, I remember when you came to visit us, we were just talking about this, a member of our community, older philosopher, political theorist, talked about socialism as an old idea. And one of our interns said, no, it's not. We now look out at this country, and in Buffalo, there may be a democratic socialist mayor, India Walton. Around the country, there are socialists. Bernie Sanders ran as a democratic socialist, though I'd submit it was more New Deal. There's also a long tradition of Michael Harrington, who founded DSA, called Left Wing of the Possible. Your book is, I would submit, decidedly trying to find a way to what we did at The Nation 10 years ago. We did a special issue called Reimagining Capitalism. You talk about a B corporation, other ways, ending the maximization of short-term shareholder profit. How do you look out, not just at this country, but at the rise of a democratic socialism, a re-rise, a resurgence?
Well, look, first, Katrina, can I just say that it's really great to be with you and Don, and it's not just great to be with you. I feel not a little emotion because I have such fond memories of my time as a Nation intern, and I feel a special affection for the magazine, for your readers, and for all of you. So I was really delighted to get the invitation to be with you. I suppose I feel like I look at the world and I look at the problems of the world and I think to myself, how can you look at the inequality crisis, which has been baked into our economies for decades, or the need to recover from the COVID pandemic, or most of all, the climate crisis? How can you look at those crises and think the answer is small scale, dare I say it, third way politics? I don't think you can see that as the answer. And so in a sense, look, my book is not trying to be a book of political strategy. It's trying to be a book of asking what needs to be done for our world. And also crucially in the British context is to, and maybe in an American context, is to convince people that there are answers out there and that there are countries around the world. You mentioned Katrín Jakobsdóttir, the Prime Minister of Iceland, but not just Iceland or Scandinavia, but New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern and places across the world where people are putting into practice ideas which can fix the problems we face, address the problems we face, and do so at scale. And look, in a way, you drew attention to this, or you mentioned this, and I think it's worth saying it, but this book was born of defeat, of me losing the 2015 general election as the leader. And, you know, the British people did me one favor, which was to give me more time to go and write a book. And, you know, it's to try and learn from my experience and to try and influence the debate. And also recognizing that some of the ideas I might talk about in the book, universal basic income being one of them, is maybe it's not an idea that's going to happen next week, next month, next year in the UK, but it's an idea that deserves to be kept alive. So I think that's really the purpose of the book. And the answer to your question is I feel encouraged. I mean, actually, when I look at what President Biden is doing, we obviously got Boris Johnson here, but when I look at what President Biden is doing, he is trying to go big. In fact, he says that actually. Now, I'm sure there are people who've got arguments about whether he's going big enough and all of that, but you know, I think this is the wave of the future, and so yeah, so I feel encouraged. You know, there's lots of reasons to feel daunted by the crises we face, but I also feel encouraged.
I wanted to ask you, the book is so timely because you have a chapter about Lina Khan, who is now the head of the FTC. And there's Timothy Wu inside the administration, but you called the chapter Lina and Goliath. When you talk about going big, you also talk about incrementalism as a step along the way. I'm interested in how one builds power to accomplish some of the ideas you talk about. One of your last chapters is about someone who's also written for us, Arnie Graf, the organizer, who came into the Labour Party campaign. And you learned a lot from that. How do you see the channels of building power to affect some of the big, bold ideas in your book?
Well, look, I think it's a really important question. And I think we should take real encouragement from the pupil climate strikers, Black Lives Matter, the divestment campaign, because of the Fight for 15, because all of these began as small scale, rather impossibilist movements. You know, I say in the book that Bismarck said that politics is the art of the possible, but actually it's probably more making the impossible or seemingly impossible possible. And, you know, all of these began as impossibilist campaigns. You know, who thought that the minimum wage could be, that $15 was a realistic demand when it was, I think the federal level was $7.25, and, you know, a couple of hundred fast food workers in New York. And I think it shows, and I know it's sort of, it may sound a bit obvious, but I think it shows what movements of people can do. And then I think just to ally that to what you said about the incremental, look, I don't dismiss the incremental, and I'm engaged as a politician. You're obviously engaged in incremental change to some degree. I think my question always about the incremental change is, does it point the way to something different, to a different vision of society? What Andre Gortz called non-reformist reforms. In other words, pointing the way to a different vision of society. I talk in the book, for example, about something which I actually care passionately about, which is father's leave for people with newborn babies, so-called use it or lose it paternity leave. Now, I know you don't have statutory paternity leave in the US, but we have 2 weeks statutory paternity leave in the UK, as well as statutory maternity leave for significantly longer. The Scandinavians, the Nordics, have something like 6 months, which is allocated to fathers, as well as more allocated or equal amounts allocated to mothers. Now, you might say, well, okay, is that going to change the world? Well, it will certainly change the experience of parents and gender equality and so on, but it also points the way to a different vision of what really matters in your society, how we structure work, how we structure gender relationships. So I think the incremental can also point the way to the transformative.
Don, may I ask, I'm going to ask one more question if I could, because I want to pick up. Someone once said, if we don't attempt what seems impossible, we'll risk facing the unimaginable, the unthinkable. This was in the context of a new security. And the virus has opened the door, it seems to me, for thinking about what security really means. I'm curious because I think the Green New Deal, the climate crisis is, of course, I think the #1 security challenge. But, in terms of ending war, the UN, flawed as it is, was created to end the scourge of war. I was curious, in this book, there was nothing touching on sort of the international security. I may be wrong, but I was interested
It's a fair point. I sort of slightly felt like I was biting off quite a lot. And so it was hard to bite that off too. But look, let me pick up what you say about the climate issue, because I think it is really important. I'm actually just writing something about this at the moment, so it's sort of fresh in my mind. Of all the issues we face domestically and internationally, I do think climate stands alone. And I think it stands alone because for the following reason, which is we are in a unique position as current generations alive today, because and the horrendous weather events in Oregon, in British Columbia, in Germany, right across the world, we can no longer say this is a future threat, or we don't quite know whether this is because of climate or not. It's definitive that we are seeing it. And at the same time, we can't say, I'm glad to say, that it's too late to do anything about it. It isn't too late. And I think what you say about security and what you say about climate is so important, because if we really as a world care about security for future generations, and indeed for current generations, that is the single biggest issue that we have to act on. And I think that's why the Green New Deal is such an important concept. But look, maybe book 2 will be more international. Go bigger. Go bigger.
Don, I'm going to turn it over to you. If I may.
Well, I'm so glad that you see this as part of a series. I want to begin just by saying what a great pleasure it is to be talking with Ed Miliband, whom I first met across Andy Kopkind's kitchen table in Vermont in, I guess it was 1990. And when all the interns in those days used to come up to Tree Frog Farm for a week of intensive conversation and occasional gardening. And I remember very vividly asking Andy after some exchange, who was that kid? Am I right in thinking you were 19 at the time?
Yeah, you're completely right. Your memory is wholly accurate. It's great to see you, Don.
It's lovely to see you, and I have to say I also miss running into you as we used to occasionally on Hampstead Heath when I'd be walking my dog. So listen, I want to begin by asking about something that you talk about in the book that I think you've just alluded to in conversation with Katrina, which is this question of changing the terrain, the terrain of our politics. You say in saying we need to go big, I'm advocating not just the consideration of ideas that promise significant change, but for politics to rediscover its sense of agency. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit both about the loss of that sense of agency, how it affected, for example, Brexit in Britain, and perhaps the Trump campaign here, and why you're focused on this rediscovering the sense of agency?
Well, I think it's a really important question. So I think in a way, the point of the book above all is to say, look, whether you agree with these ideas or not, we can't look at the way the world is and say, well, there are some things that are too difficult to tackle, too big to take on. And I think the left in the 1990s, the center left in government, sort of got into the idea that inequality, globalization, there were kind of facts that were sort of almost immutable and didn't lend themselves to political effect. And I think that is very dangerous. And I think in a way, it opened the way for Trump and Brexit and others to come along and say, well, we are the people. You know, if you like, there's a sort of center-left, center-right consensus that there was some that there were some things that just were really difficult to tackle and really difficult to do anything about,
or outside of politics,
were sort of inevitable. And I think that I'm afraid that did give an opportunity for the right, because the right has changed shape. You see, I think it's really important to focus not just on ourselves but on our opponents. And the right has changed shape. You know, Johnson and Trump. So somebody said that Johnson is sort of halfway between normality and Trump, and there may be a sort of certain truth in that. The right has changed shape in the sense that if I think about my opponent, who was David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister in 2015, he basically said, look, what Ed Miliband was saying about inequality and intervening in markets and so on, it's completely wrong. We don't need that. And he was sort of part of the center-right kind of consensus, if you like. Johnson's argument, and to an extent Trump's argument, and it's really important to focus on this, was different. I always remember that ad Trump did 2 days before the 2016 election, and some of it could come out of the mouths of the left-wing Labour leader we had at the time, Jeremy Corbyn, about people have lost their jobs, the global elite, all of that. And the right appropriated this sense of we can change things. And Katrina mentioned my constituents, and I probably said this in 2016 when I came to the nation. They were saying to me about Brexit, it wasn't about immigration or Europe. Those may have been issues, but the fundamental thing was we want something different. We want a new beginning. We want something better. And it goes actually to Katrina's point about security and insecurity and risk and the way risk had been loaded onto them. And so I think part of what I'm saying in this, Don, is unless and this is where it is about political strategy, unless the left in politics meets those challenges head on and at scale, the right will outdo us. Now, we can think the right solutions are not good solutions, absolutely, and won't solve the problem. But if they appropriate the emotion and the unhappiness, we are in trouble. And you see, Johnson talks in Britain about a phrase he calls levelling up, which is to tackle the inequalities of our country. We're a deeply unequal country between North and South and so on. Now, it's baloney that he's going to tackle these things, and it's completely empty. But it is interesting that he is trying to appropriate that economic discontent. And that's why we have to show that we've got bigger answers, in my view.
Well, I think that's interesting, and it leads to maybe a question that's about Britain, but that also seems to be applying here, which is the extent to which the Labour Party in Britain and the Democratic Party in the United States have become detached from the working class. And so that, you've seen this determined effort, not just by Johnson, but in fact by his British opponent, Dominic Cummings was very articulate on this, an attempt to sort of make a direct appeal to disaffected workers to say that, the left parties represent the cultural elite. They don't care about you. We care about you. Even hearing a labor leader use the language of leveling is, to me, as shocking as hearing Donald Trump use the language of trade deals, and indicting trade deals in pretty much the same terms that leaders of big unions had been doing for years, but had been excluded by the Clintons from sort of economic power. So I wondered, if you had some thoughts about both this, what seems to me an ongoing effort to detach or to reattach the working class to parties of the right rather than parties of the left, which goes far beyond the US and Britain. I mean, it's happening in Europe and in Latin America as well.
So I think there's at least two things going on here, maybe three. I think the first is that the right in Britain is trying to do what the right in the US has done for some time, which is use cultural issues as a wedge with our traditional constituencies. If you contrast two general elections that we had in recent years in Britain, 2017 and 2019, we had the same leader, Jeremy Corbyn. In 2017, he put on a greater share of the vote than any Labour leader since 1945. He didn't win the election, but he came very close. And the Brexit issue had essentially been closed down because Labour was saying we're going to stick with the decision that was made. In 2019, this wasn't the only factor, but in 2019, we were saying we were going to have another referendum. And Johnson essentially used that as a wedge issue to claim that Labour doesn't care about its traditional constituencies who voted for Brexit and so on. So I think the first thing is this attempt to draw cultural divides, and that can be on a whole range of issues. Secondly, as I've said, to talk the economic language and essentially run against. See, Johnson is running against both Labour not having, in his view, done enough to tackle the divides I talked about, levelling up and so on, but also the previous Conservative administration. He's saying he's almost presenting himself as a new administration in relation to these issues. And then the third, I guess so they're two of the things that are going on. I think the third thing which we can't ignore in this is the deeper institutional questions about what are the institutions that used to tie Labour to its traditional electorate and what has happened to them. And that's in particular the trade unions. I mean, we are, the decline of trade unionism and the decline of organised labour and indeed organised labour settings, if you like, has a sort of massive effect on this, in my view. So I guess it's maybe not the grounds for the question, but I think as far as I can see, that is what is going on. Now, what's my answer to it? I mean, the answer has got to be, I think there is a coalition to be built around big economic change. I think that of our traditional previous people who supported Labour, but also younger metropolitan people living mainly in cities. I think there is a coalition to be built, in my view, definitely. But secondly, there is also a longer term issue. It goes to Katrina's point about community organising and so on, which is how we organise, what we do about trade unions. My friend Archon Fung, who is a professor at the Kennedy School, has written this very good piece about levels of power. And one of the points he makes is that we often talk about policy, but we don't talk about what is actually going to structurally shift power. And I think what Biden is saying about the role of trade unions and all of that, I mean, that is something that we need to pay much, much more heed to, in my view. Because if we have a hollowed out workplace in terms of the role of trade unions, it's not just bad for inequality and all of those things. I think it breaks lots of the ties that people have and the kind of consciousness that it helps build.
One of the things that really, thank you. I think that goes quite a way towards answering the question. One of the things that really struck me in your book was, and I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, but the extent to which you seem to really be trying to learn from your mistakes. And
it's unusual in politics, I think.
Well, I mean, we have here in America, we have the example of Jimmy Carter as our greatest former president. So maybe,
it would be a great compliment to be the Jimmy Carter of the UK.
But, and I wondered, so I guess, you've talked about Brexit and in a way, the Labour Party's failure to anticipate what that was really about. But I'm wondering whether there are other, particular mistakes of your own that you feel this book is an attempt to address or redress.
I mean, that's a welcome invitation. So here's the way I would put it: is that Labour was in government, for those people watching or listening. Labour was in government in 1997 to 2010, and I took over in 2010, a few months after the general election that we lost. I think it's very hard when you're coming out of power. And I was trying to shift the party on from New Labour, and where we had been, similar to the New Democrats, because I felt that we hadn't addressed some of these deeper issues. What I got right was an analysis about the scale of inequality and the issues that people were facing. I think what I didn't get right was this, in my view, was the primary colour solutions. I kind of went big in my analysis, and I went sort of small to medium in my answers. And I think that was the big thing. So I sort of ended up caught between two stools, which I wasn't reassuring enough for the people who wanted a sort of reassurance, and if you like, centrism, and I wasn't radical enough for the people who wanted big change and who felt the country needed a big change. And I think, look, I didn't come to an instant analysis after I lost in 2015. But what makes me say that? I learned A, from the Brexit referendum, B, from what I said happened in 2017 when Corbyn did significantly better, actually, in the share of the vote that he got with this primary colours view. I mean, look, it's also fair to say, slightly in my defence, that I think the things have changed in the sense that we'd had 4.5 years or so of austerity at that point, and now we've had essentially 10 or 11 years with significant government intervention during the pandemic. I think the other thing I would say, Don, though, I think this is in a way the most important thing, is taking a step back from all this. I think we know that there was an era, which was 1979 in our case and Thatcher, and 1980 in your case and Reagan, and to sort of 2008, I would say. And I think we're in what we call in Britain in football extra time, and I think what you call overtime. We're sort of in overtime. We're in the overtime period of that old settlement. And I think parties of both colours are kind of searching for, what does the new settlement look like? And, I think it was written about Biden, is he going to be the first post-Reagan president? And I think there's something in this. And I think, so I think that's in a way the kind of question for us, which is, what does this new settlement look like? And I think that's where the left has to be, and I think that's what Biden is trying to, for as far as I can see, the path he's trying to plot.
Well, in terms of this new settlement, would you bristle at being described as making the case for a kind of left populism? I mean, one of the things that's striking in your book is how much you keep sort of talking about devolution of power.
Look, definitely. I mean, I think I'm not sure what exactly the label I would say. I think devolution is we are a very centralized country, unlike the US. We are the most centralized country in Europe. And it means that I think it really, different democracies that are undermined for different reasons, but it really undermines faith in our democracy. Because if I think about my local area, people think, well, if I vote locally, does it really make a difference? Where is power lying? And I think I talk quite a lot in the book about how we extend democracy, and you'll be aware of this idea of citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting. I mean, I think we need to be not just devolving power down to local level, down to different politicians, but also devolving. I think people have higher expectations now of how they can have a say, and so I think sort of representative democracy is obviously the bedrock. And in the US, you obviously have to defend representative democracy against the assault on it. But I think beyond that, we need to think about how we devolve power kind of away from politicians and bring the public in much more, because I think we face a real crisis of people thinking, well, it's a long running crisis, but I think a sense of, is there much point in voting? Can my voice really make any difference?
Well, in that context, there are two things I want to touch on, and then we'll go to some questions from our audience.
I was going to ask just quickly about mutual aid and solidarity, which you bring up in terms of reconnecting people to democracy. you talked about the hollowness of institutions, but there is a wave of new institutions dealing with loneliness, with alienation. And I wondered, if you saw that moving across the book as you wrote it, but also in this country, unlike yours, there's an importance in showing people that government can actually make a difference in their lives. Think of 2010, government, take your hands off my Medicare. And so I think that has been a message of this administration, including the kind of devolution piece. But it's a very, the distrust of government is such a deep, deep part of this country that I wonder how you see connecting, reconnecting people.
It's interesting this, because one of the things that is keeping the Conservatives doing okay in the opinion polls is the fact that they introduced this furlough scheme, where people got paid 80% of their wages if they had stopped working because of the pandemic, because of the public health measures. And I think it's interesting this, because I think there's lots of interesting things in your question, but one is about the sense that government can deliver. And I think it has made a difference. And there's something really interesting has happened with this furlough, because lots of people have used the furlough like a UBI in a way, a universal basic income, to try out different work. And lots of people are changing jobs anecdotally because they've been able to be on the furlough, but actually tried something else where you were able to work. I think there's one thing that's interesting. I think secondly, I think you've got a really interesting point, Katrina, about mutual aid, because there's lots of survey evidence in Britain where when people think about the country, they're much more likely now to say it's a country where we look out for each other rather than look after ourselves. And there has been a real springing up of mutual aid groups across the country, of people looking out for each other during the pandemic. And in a sense, I think there is part of the task of politics is to make sense of the collective experience we've been through, and to say, what's the spirit? How do we then build on that spirit? In our country, it very much harks back to 1945 and the spirit of the post-war period, when we'd had this collective experience of war, of 6 years of war, and then people said, well, we've got to build something better. And I think that is the battle over which the next election will be fought. Who can really build something different and better in the future?
I thought one of the things that really I loved about the book was your candor about, not about, in a sense, the limitations of the state, or the limitations of what the state can do as an actor. I mean, I'm thinking about, we have Bernie Sanders trying to push through to go big in terms of this budget reconciliation resolution. It's empowering the state. And we have a lot of, in America, we don't have a functioning welfare state. So in a sense, it's understandable that people would be much more enthusiastic about the possibility. But you're right that people on my side of politics are brilliant at castigating the failures of the market. We are much less good at being candid about the shortcomings of the state. Just as the market can treat people like commodities to be bought and sold, so the state can treat people like cogs in a machine. And I just think that's a really important note of caution, as we expand and empower the state, that we don't hand everything to the state.
I think it's what kind of state, and this is not easy, but it's just, I see this as a constituency member of parliament. I talk in the book about my experience of the floods. We had terrible floods in my constituency, my district, in 2019, and there were great examples of the state and the community coming together, and there were some not so good examples of the state's rigidities and the sort of the impersonal, rather high-handed nature of the state. And I think that is such an important thing for people on the left to think about. And I think it's, if I'm honest with you, Don, I think, and I felt this when I was leader, it's a sort of, it's something we don't talk about enough. And there have been different approaches to reforming the state. There was a sort of targets model that we had in Britain when the Labour government was in power. So we set lots of targets, but that tended to sort of disempower frontline workers. There's obviously a privatization model, outsourcing the state, which is not an answer. There's a sort of Whitehall knows best, as we would put it, sort of the central state knows best. And I think thinking about how, it goes back to the point in the sense that I was making earlier, how do you really empower communities through giving them power? and involving users in the way that, and individuals and communities in the way that the state works. And I think that is a sort of massive work in progress for the way the state functions. And I think that has that does have quite a determinative aspect on whether people think the state is good or not. I mean, sometimes people just want the state to deliver. You know, if it's shots in arms or checks during coronavirus, the state just needs to deliver. But there's lots of things to do with healthcare and climate and all kinds of things where the idea that the state is going to deliver on its own, like a sort of package coming through your door, just is not the way that we're going to build a successful set of services. Okay.
I'm going to start now with questions from the audience, and there's a terrific question from Jen Colby, which I'm just going to read out because it's not really condensable. Let's see. There's clear data that white racial identity politics are a significant factor in increasing support for the right, the radical right. And in America, there's been decades-long religious, conservative, evangelical movements to capture the Republican Party. But the left continues to focus on economic inequality and seems incapable of effectively countering wedge identity politics. So how do we challenge or overcome these manufactured cultural divides?
I mean, look, I think that question is probably kind of beyond me giving a very good answer, because it's sort of, it's a lot focused on the US. I'll tell you one thing that has interested me, and I'm sure you guys know much more about this than I do, but this work on the so-called race-class narrative, which as I understand it, tries to call out. I think the left can be very defensive on these cultural issues and essentially want to sort of not talk about them. And I think it's Ian Haney Lopez and Annette Schenker-Osario, I think, who work on this. And you know, their point is, look, not talking about it is really not going to get you anywhere. You actually got to call out what elites are trying to do to divide different elements of working people. And I don't know whether that's completely transposable to the UK context, but I think there is a certain way in which, you know, if you think about what I said earlier, it was saying to people, it was saying that the right is trying to employ this tactic. And I think in a sense, we might be better off calling the right out for employing this tactic. We had this issue recently around the England football team, who sadly didn't win the European championships, but we came closer than we've come for 50 years to winning, more than 50 years to winning a major championship. My children were incredibly upset about it. But actually what's so interesting is that the players were taking the knee before the game. And this may be familiar to you, it may not, but Boris Johnson's spokesperson refused to condemn those who booed them taking the knee. And this was just before the championships began. And then when England did better and better during the championships, suddenly Boris Johnson put on an England shirt and said, you know, somebody says in the chat, if Katha Pollitt says Italy forever, thanks so much. Best regards to you too, Katha. But I think what was so interesting about that was that so Johnson essentially then realised he was on the wrong side of this divide, and then Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, did call him out for really what he'd been doing, and I think in a way you're better off calling the right out on these issues and saying, look, well, this is what they're trying to do. And then the only other thing I would say, and I can't transpose this to the US context, is that, you know, people, if I think about people in my constituency, they're smart, and they will see what the right is trying to do. And, you know, I mean, the notion that sort of in our country, people in my constituency don't want to attack racial injustice, it's just not even true. So I think it's different in different settings, but for what it's worth, my thought is you got to call the right out on this.
Look, I don't want to be difficult here, but I'm intrigued to note that you saw this as a US question, because I still have the mug in my kitchen in Hampstead that Labour sold when you were leader that said curbs on immigration, where instead of calling the right out on a wedge issue, Labour...
Well, look, you learn, you know, look, that's why I'm willing to say we look, what I was trying to draw attention to, at least when I was leader and talking about these issues, was to say that we had the combination of significant immigration and a very exploitative labor market. And that there was a danger of that in relation to undercutting wages. But look, you learn from this. And I'm willing to say that we should be calling the right out more on these issues.
And then we have a question, thank you. We have a question from, just for the record, the entire London Bureau of the Nation, past and future members and descendants, we're all rooting for England. So, the question is this is from Ken Petroulis. Isn't your incremental parental leave also an expression harkening back to the 200-year history of the labor movement that includes child labor laws, shrinking of work hours, and the right to strike?
Definitely. And look, this issue of, I'm glad Ken has raised this. And I think the whole issue of working time, which I talk about in the book, I think is so interesting because, you know, we've had this debate here about the 4-day week, 3-day weekend, you know, but really this is a question of hours. And why have the number of hours gone from, in the UK case, something like an average of 62 hours to something 30-something hours on average over the last 150 years or so? It's because of the role of trade unions in bargaining down those hours. And Ken is right that, you know, there's also, I mean, that's also true of the other things that he mentioned. So I think the trade unions are fundamental to this, but I think it also, in a way, it's the next frontier of labor rights. I mean, there's a whole debate here. Labor is taking a quite forward radical position on people being able to work flexibly, part-time, working from home. In Finland, I think it is, you can work 4 hours earlier or 4 hours later in the day, and you can choose where you do 50% of your work by law. And I think, you know, I think that is definitely the kind of area, the kind of vision we should be looking at. So it's a really good question.
Thanks. I'm going to follow that with a question from Anne Martin, but also I think from our own Julia Tash about how do you transition from individual or small group actions to going big? Anne says, in Washington State, we've created a way for people to join and get credit for participating in community solar projects so that while each person can't grow big, the cumulative effort may be big. But I'm wondering about these mechanisms and then whether you see the role of mutual aid groups as something that government should eventually take over, or should some of these efforts be left to mutual aid groups?
I think the mutual aid groups are more interesting because of the spirit that they represent, actually. And I think it, you know, if I think about it, you know, the pandemic revealed who we really were and what we really cared about. We had this tradition in the UK of clapping for carers. So at 8 p.m. every Thursday evening, we'd go out on the doorsteps in our streets to clap the carers. And eventually the carers, this is like people who work in our National Health Service, elderly care, eventually people said, okay, enough of this. We'd like, you know, to be paid decently and have security. The claps almost became a sort of excuse for not, you know, was started to be seen, at least in terms of what the government was doing, as an excuse for not rewarding them properly. But I think it you know, it revealed when the crunch came what really mattered to us. And I think our social and economic institutions are so far away from that. Just on the question about how does these additive small efforts sort of amount to something bigger? Well, I think partly it's about movements. I just want to sort of underline this point that, you know, this whole Overton window question, what is feasible and what is possible? I mean, I'm just so struck by this. Like, just take the climate issue. You know, after I lost in 2015, I approached the Conservative government then and said, look, we've really got to legislate for putting our emissions to zero. I'd legislated when I was in government for 80% reductions in our emissions by 2050. And I said, the science is changing. And they were pretty reticent. They sort of said we might do something, but they were reticent to really act. You know, net zero by 2050, at least in the UK, is now the relatively conservative position. It's the law, but it's the kind of lowest common denominator. Now, that isn't because politicians made this happen. It's partly the movement, now it's partly the science, but it's also the movement, the people, climate strikers, Extinction Rebellion and others who really pushed. So I think it's partly that. Also community energy, I think giving people a stake, whether it's in the workplace and the voice of employees or in relation to climate and community energy projects, giving people a stake in this future is so important, it seems to me. And so I think there's different ways in which these individual acts can add up to something bigger.
When you talk about giving people a stake, seems to me you're really talking about empowerment and how how do you give people a sense that they actually have agency. But we keep coming back to doing that in terms of economics. And I'm just going to, I'm going to revert to Cather, who basically wonders whether it's not really about economics. Maybe the distrust of government has to do not just that it doesn't deliver, but that government is too liberal, pushing a feminist or a diversity or an identity politics agenda that core voters for the Labour Party in Britain and the Democrats in the US are just resistant to on non-economic grounds. What do you say to that?
You see, I'm going to sound like an economic determinist here. I'm just sort of holding my hands up here. Maybe I'm sort of my father's son a little bit. I just tell you about my experience on Brexit and my constituents.
Please.
It really wasn't. I mean, I'm not saying that something like immigration wasn't an issue or mistrust of the European Union, but honestly, the root of this is it's an ex-mining constituency. The mining jobs had all kinds of problems, but they did provide a decent wage, some kind of pension, some kind of security, social housing, and risk was shared. And it's not to romanticize those jobs, but they've been replaced by much more insecure, much more low wage, much more tenuous employment. And also without the recognition that those mining jobs had, without that sense of community. And I just don't think you can sort of ignore, I sort of think that is the root of this. I mean, so I think the right wants to convince us that they almost want to make us, feel like, well, we're really out of step with, people who, used to vote Labour or Democrat, and we've got to sort of, rein in what we believe on, feminism or racial justice. I don't know. I can't speak for the US context. I can only speak for my own context. But the as I say, the debates I had with people were, we want something better, we want something new, we want decent jobs. And in a way, I think to ascribe to people, well, it's just I'm not saying that Cather is doing this, but to ascribe to people that it's all cultural and it's not to do with economics, I don't fundamentally buy it. I also don't actually know where that takes you, because like where does that sort of take you in the argument? I mean, what does it mean you say? I think the left is much better off. I think this is what Biden is trying to do in going big on the economics and saying this is the big difference we can make to your life.
Here's two linked. So one question is, one thing I noticed, maybe you could talk a little bit about, just as an example of something hopeful, is the influence on your thinking and on our world of the work of James Fishkin. And how that's, I mean, I was astonished to discover that this was something that was happening not just in Scandinavia, but in Texas. So maybe you'd like to say a little bit about that.
So James Fishkin is the sort of godfather of deliberative democracy, at least in its modern form. He wasn't around in ancient Athens. And this is about bringing together representative samples of the population. There's different ways of doing it to debate key issues. It's sort of not so well known that Texas's move to wind power, which I know was sort of, people tried to blame some of the problems that Texas had on that completely wrongly, was partly prompted by some deliberative work that was done, I think in the late 80s or 90s around this. Ireland had these two referenda on equal marriage and on relaxing its very restrictive abortion laws, both of which were preceded by these citizens' assemblies. And it's really interesting because the politicians were incredibly reticent move on these issues in Ireland, and the deliberative assemblies gave them the sort of confidence to do so, because they both came out with strong majorities, like a couple of hundred people, in favor of change. And so, and I think, and basically, it's really interesting. In the UK, they are now being pioneered all around the country, actually, in relation to the climate issue. And I think if there's one issue where I would say we need, and we've done it, it's been done nationally in the UK, is there's one issue where we've got to take people with us. It is the changes that we're going to see in relation to tackling the climate crisis. And I think there is a real role, both locally and nationally, for these deliberative processes. And look, in a sense, they model the kind of democracy we'd like to see, the kind of deliberative democracy and processes that we would like to see. But they also, I think they partly can make politicians braver, but I think they can also give real insight into how people think policy should be modeled and the approach should be modeled. And I think they can confer some kind of legitimacy. I think there's a sort of question about how much legitimacy you can get from it. And I sort of discussed that in the book. But I'm basically, it's also called sortition. I'm a big fan of this kind of jury service, political jury service.
Well, it seemed to give politicians cover to break deadlocks. I mean, it made me wonder whether we could do something like it on healthcare.
Yeah.
So last question from the audience, and this is from Emma Knox. And she asks two questions, but I'm particularly focusing on her second. How did you find the people that you profiled? And then what is one idea that makes you feel exceptionally hopeful? So you've got 20 in the book, but
wow.
This is the desert island. This is the album you'd have to rescue from the waves.
Okay, so actually, controversially, the idea that makes me most hopeful actually is the universal basic income. And I talk a lot about Alaska and the permanent fund dividend in the book, which is obviously not the universal basic income, but is a sort of significantly smaller version of it. And I think the reason it makes me hopeful, it's the most difficult idea to achieve. I think the reason it makes me hopeful is it gives everybody the kind of minimum floor, the minimum guarantee of security that the middle class and upper class can take for granted, or are more likely to be able to take for granted. And I think it would have a transformative effect. I think it's very, very hard to get there. But if you gave me sort of complete autocratic power, I think if I had to pick one idea in the book, I think I would go for that. I mean, in terms of the way I found the people I write about in the book, I mean, a lot of them came through our podcast. I mean, this podcast called Reasons to Be Cheerful, because what we found about the podcast is we have politicians on, and politicians are fine, but it's the people who actually who are just kind of ordinary people, if you like, doing amazing things and campaigns that are the most inspiring. And I think if I had to say one thing that makes me the kind of most hopeful, and I think should make us all hopeful, it's the fact that, you just see people doing transformative things. I mean, I tell this story in the book about how when I lost the election, I went on a community organizing course. Katrina talked about Arnie Graf, and it's sort of something like that. And I got told this story about these guys from Somalia, who are originally from Somalia, their families are from Somalia, who lived in Cardiff in Wales. And their beef is the wrong way of putting it. Their argument was there's a well-known branch of like a chicken shop called Nando's in Britain, and they were very annoyed that none of the Nando's were halal. And they said, what we really want to do is organize for one of the Nando's to be halal. And okay, so this is kind of a relatively small change. And they managed to succeed partly by getting the Bishop of Cardiff, I think, to threaten to dress up as a chicken and embarrass the people from Nando's. And in a way, look, it just shows that, even on the most elemental level, people often have more latent power than they realize if they've got the right techniques to organize and exercise it and unleash it.
Interesting.
I'm
going to turn it back to you in a second, Katrina. I just want to say it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I commend the book to everyone on this Zoom. We'll have a link in the chat, I assume, to the book. And also, if you want to hear more of Ed exploring big ideas, we should put a link to, is the podcast ongoing? Can we link to that as well? So let's make sure we have a link to the podcast as well. And it's lovely to talk to you again, and great to see you, and best regards to Justine and the boys.
It was lovely to see you.
Katrina, over to you.
And thank you, Don, and thank you everyone for all the questions. Ed, thank you for this very honest, candid conversation. I take back what I said at the top about recovering ex-leader. I think we have a resurgent leader who's thought hard and is on a journey. But I want to note the Overton window, which you spoke of, and we speak of at The Nation. Not to be self-serving, but let me for a moment just suggest that you as a former Nation comrade, that the Nation has contributed in measure to the Overton window. I mean, when I think of the issues in your book, which everyone must buy, living wage, 15 minimum, Green New Deal, participatory budgeting. So I take solace and great hope from your book, because I do think people need ideas to mobilize around. A lot of people everywhere don't know what to do. It seems so big. So I think it's a real service. My sister reads Yes! The magazine, and said her friends love The Nation, but sometimes it feels like no! We're working on maybe. And just to say that you fulfill the mantra that one never leaves the nation. And your comrades on this call, Peter Meyer, Katha Pollitt, and others, join me in thanking you. And I think this is a far more hopeful time than when we last met, though by Zoom. But July 2016, I think we've all learned a lot. And your book is, I think, a guide for those who want to take the journey with you and think anew about their own community's power, empowerment. So very grateful, and I'm glad you spoke to the coalition that could be built around big economic change. I don't see you as an economic determinist, but I do see you as the son of your father, who also.
Well, look, I really appreciate the time, Katrina and Don, and it's been fantastic to be with you. And I'm a massive fan of both of you and the magazine. And I was actually just talking to a guy who works for me, but I was saying I was doing this call, and I was remembering incredibly fondly my time as a Nation intern. It was just it was such a sort of magical experience, and that's because of the people who work at the magazine. So thank you very much for having me.
We won't refer to the other Nation intern.
No, I haven't mentioned
Nicholas Clegg.
Mr. Clegg.
Those who don't know, he was deputy prime minister, and he's now Facebook's global poobah. Anyway, you said very wisely in the book, it's not so much that, though you have a very good chapter on antitrust and the predatory dominance, but that he supported Cameron and made that.
Yeah, he didn't make a great career move after politics, let's put it that way.
Well, you worked with someone else. I think he worked with Mr. Hitchens, but all right, enough. Thank you very, very much for this conversation. Really grateful to you. And thank you, Don, and thank you all for participating.
Lovely to see you all.
And thanks for the great questions. See you again.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye.